Welcome to Suffice's webinar, Winning with Words, How to Make Your Next Grant Application Stand Out. We have two presenters with us today. So I'd like to introduce you to Stachen Frederick and Lee Rose. Stachen Frederick has over 15 years experience in the field of community and program development internationally and in Canada. She has done a number of consultancy jobs for organizations such as the Jane and Finch Family and Community Centre, the Spot, the AIDS Committee of Toronto, and Gateway for New Canadians. Her unique blend of social work and the arts has led to the development of a number of notable projects, including Hip to Be Global and Race to Youth Leadership. She is the founder of Braids for AIDS. Her community development work has been recognized by Black History Ottawa, the High Commission of Trinidad and Tobago, YMCA Canada, and How She Hustles with CBC Toronto. She is currently the Executive Director of Weston Frontline Centre, a youth centre in a priority neighbourhood in Toronto. Lee Rose is the lead of Community Foundations of Canada's work in the field of knowledge philanthropy and works across the organization, its network of 191 community foundations, and the broader philanthropic sector to mobilize and activate non-financial capital in the pursuit of social change. He is also the leader for the Community Knowledge Exchange, a platform that seeks to catalyze and curate fundamental shifts in how individuals, institutions, and communities build and share knowledge in the pursuit of social change. Lee's connections to the philanthropic and community sector are both pan-Canadian and local. He currently sits on the board of Imagine Canada and is also the past president of the 10 Oaks Project, an organization that connects and engages children and youth from LGBTQ communities in activities rooted in play. We're very pleased to have them here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Stachen, and away we go.
So I'm talking today from the community perspective, and from my bio, I have lived in Ottawa. If you hear my accent, I'm from Trinidad, and I'm currently living in Toronto. And my experience with grants started at Ottawa U, and it's good to see that there is a number of students who have registered for this webinar, because that's where my journey around writing grants. So I founded the first collaborative Black Students Association at the University of Ottawa, and being able to get funding for events on campus required me putting proposals to our student center. And so from that basic sort of seeing a need in the community, requesting funding, that leads up to the bigger grants that I've been able to receive. When I moved to Toronto as a junior staff, I started writing grants because I saw needs in the community, and working with some youth. We wanted specific youth-led programs in the community, and so helping them to write grants. And of course, now being the executive director of Western Frontline Centre, as well as my own not-for-profit organization, Braids for AIDS, I have done grants for corporations, organizations, funders like Ontario Trillium Foundation, United Way, Women's College Hospital. So a very broad range of grants that I've written. So before you begin to write your application, the first thing that you need to do is research. So, and in speaking with a number of community sector workers, many do not like to hear the word research. Now, we do have a number of academia on this webinar, so perhaps research gives you a buzz. But the reality is that for most workers who are applying for grants, research is not the main thing. But regardless of whatever sector you're in, you must do research to find what type of funders will fund your area of work, whether it's government, private foundations, universities, individuals. You need to figure out which areas are they funding. Child and youth studies, the environment, health, social entrepreneurship. What are they going to be funding in terms in relation to their budget? Are they funding capital expenses, programming, research, events? And one of the important things to do in researching is to read the guidelines of the applications of funders. Notice keywords, and in those keywords is what you can then utilize to use in writing your application. You want to read the questions properly, and I will share my experience working with a community organization, why it's so important to read the guidelines and what they're funding. So a community worker spent a lot of time writing the grant and left the budget to the end. And in not reading the guidelines carefully, applied for things like programming supplies, travel for the youth participants, food, submitted the application, and then at the end, this application was only for capital funding. So for example, if they wanted to buy a computer to run a youth program, that would have been something that they could have applied for. So a whole amount of time, and it was a great application, but here by not reading what the funder would be funding, made an organization lose an opportunity. So again, in the research and reading all the guidelines, the questions, I would also say attend. Many funders, while there might be online applications, a lot of funders are trying to get to understand who are applying for their funding, and there are what we call information sessions being carried out by funders, and that's an opportunity to get feedback on your questions. And also, a face is better than a paper. I always say that funders fund people, not proposals. And so that's an opportunity for you to build a relationship with a funder. In looking at common elements of proposals, some I won't focus on because Lee would be speaking on some of them later on. But key elements of proposals will include your vision, your mission, your activities. And the vision and mission are standard, and and a funder could be able to go on a website and see your vision and mission. So this is something that you normally would copy and paste. In the activities of your organization is not just listing what activities you do, but what sets you apart from others. So I'll give an example with Braids for AIDS. Many times I get asked by funders, well, what makes you different from other service providers focusing on HIV/AIDS within the African Caribbean community? And I say it sets us apart because we utilize beauty in terms of hair and braiding to engage a population that will not typically be engaged in HIV/AIDS conversations. And so just naming, it's not necessarily about fabricating and making yourself seem grandiose, but it's about really sharing your story. Then, of course, to organizational capacity. Do you have the infrastructure to carry out this project? And sort of the genesis of this webinar is looking at community-based projects and university, and that's where you look at partnerships. So you want to be clear in looking at your organizational capacity and partnerships, what each one is bringing to the table. Are you working with student bodies, racialized students bodies, students associations, which community-based organizations, and what are they bringing to the table? When you look at your project description, you have to be very detailed on your project. For example, if you're doing a research project, if you're conducting focus groups, key informant interviews, surveys, you must be clear on how many are you going to be conducting, whether it's 5 focus groups, 15 key informant interviews, 50 surveys, be even more specific to say for how long, 1.5 hours, where, for example, whether you're doing it in a community setting, classroom, and who is leading, whether it's student-led, professor-facilitated, and again, this going back with your partnership. And then looking at the target population and need. So it's, of course, very easy to go online and find statistics on need. But what I've been seeing lately from a lot of funders, are they asking for your internal data? How are you utilizing the information that you are getting from your clients to inform the growth of your organization, or what's the next steps for your organization? Again, you want to, in some of the common elements of proposals is alignment to funding priorities, and Lee will be talking a little bit more about the alignment. But you want to ensure that this project aligns with the funder, so that the funder feels that if I invest into this project, it will help to advance the goals of that funder and the organization. When you look at the evaluation and reporting, again, it's sharing your stories. When I talked just now about the need and the target population, this is showing what have you utilized in the past, whether it's surveys, focus groups, and how are you going to utilize that in this project, and even in determining what are the deliverables for this particular project that you're applying for. Sustainability. How is the program going to last after the funding ends? And again, it ties into the partnerships. And this is, so again, in talking about your partnerships and organizational capacity, it's saying, if you have a partner on the table, this is how they plan to assess not only during the funding, but even after the funding ends. You want to look at the work plan, and a typical work plan will have things around goals, activities, who's responsible, evaluations, timeline, and I'll just give an example of one. So, for example, a goal to increase the awareness of HIV/AIDS in a student population. An activity would be to host 5 sexual health health workshops on topics such as drugs, safe sex. Evaluations may be surveys, feedback forms. Who's responsible? A hired student facilitator. I always say when working with student populations, you want to put into your budget something, whether it's an honorarium, a salary to hire a student. The evaluator may be a professor, and then a timeline might be September 2017 to December 1st, 2017. So these are just some examples of what, in a work plan you would see. And these are examples of questions. Again, I said Lee will speak a little bit more on alignment. In evaluation, a question that I've seen is, please indicate how you plan to evaluate the success of your project. Under operational and partnerships, what other community partners are involved with your project or program, and how are they contributing to its success? Now, word counts are becoming smaller and smaller, so you want to be asset-based. You want to focus on what are you able to bring to the table, to the funder. A lot of funders now are looking at engagement. How are funders going to be engaged in this project? It's not just about providing a check, but how are they going to be engaged in moving forward? What their interest, whether it's in youth, whether it's in the environment, etc. And with a budget, these are just some pieces around a budget in terms of writing your grant, making sure the budget adds up to the amount in the body of the proposal. So not only being from the community, I've also sat on grant review committees, and I've seen organizations where they would put a figure in the body of the proposal, but the budget, let's say it's on an Excel spreadsheet, does not add up. So you want to make sure that these add up. Making sure that the items mentioned in the budget aligns to programming details. So if you're going to be hosting focus groups, make sure that there's a budget line for the focus groups. You want to be so detailed, but understanding, yes, that there is, a word count, that there's not so much questions for a funder to wonder about your program. You want to document in-kind donations, including work of volunteers, space, and administrative support. And then again, as I mentioned, one of the things that I like to see in applications is where that there's funding for young people. A lot of funders like to see that there's that ability to engage young people, not just in the program, but in the decision-making process, and providing them some sort of compensation for their work. And once you have, done some of those pieces in a very short sort of webinar and me presenting, you want to be able to read over your application, have someone read it for you when you have been working on an application for a very long time. It's always good to have another eye on the application. You might want to get an editor, as well as have a checklist of documents. Some funders provide a checklist, but regardless of if the funder provides a checklist, it's a good tool to have to ensure that you have all the documents that is needed when you are applying for funding. And as I mentioned, I have the opportunity to talk to funders, and they may ask me about, my organization. But a lot of funders are having interviews, whether it be telephone interviews. Recently, I heard of a funder that actually had a community group do a sort of presentation to them around their project. But it's an opportunity to build relationships and, again, to ask questions. So if you hadn't attended an information session, and sometimes an information session is a criteria to even apply for an organization for funding. But if you have that opportunity to speak to the funder, you want that opportunity to ask questions and to build a relationship with the funder. Thank you.
Okay, I think you finished up there, Stachen. Thank you so much for that. That was incredibly useful. And now we're going to welcome Lee Rose for his presentation.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today with the Suffice Crew and with Stachen to talk a little bit about funding and getting the grant writing for grant writing. So I'm going to flip to the other side of the table now and talk a little bit about the perspectives from a foundation and a grant maker. So some of the stuff actually will be echoes of quite what Stachen has mentioned, but just from our side of the table. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about what community foundations are. So Community Foundations of Canada is a national network for about 191 or so community foundations that are located in communities from coast to coast to coast across Canada. We have in communities large and small, so the Vancouver Foundation on the West Coast, all the way to the Rural Community Foundation in Nova Scotia, and all points in between. So we reach into 90% of Canadian communities, collectively manage $5.1 billion in assets. And unlike private or other foundations, we are also fundraisers and looking to build endowments and to grow the assets that we have in community foundations. And our significant force for philanthropy, I think you can see the numbers there, that $262 million was gifted to community foundations in 2015, which resulted in net investment in communities in the format of grants of $243 million in 2015. In addition to grant-making, community foundations are starting to think more about impact investing and socially responsible investing, and are seeing a large percentage of our portfolio starting to move to more ethically and sustainable investments as well. In addition to being a national network, we are also connected to a global network of community philanthropy. I think there are more than 1,900 community foundations across the globe. As funders, this is an overview of some of the funding priorities and focus areas for community foundations. Now, each community foundation in each community, and just like any other funder, sets their own priority areas for their granting and the way that their assets are managed. So if you look at the chart on the left here, the $243 million in grants that are dispersed gives you a rough idea of the types of projects that community foundations are typically interested in funding. With a significant portion in terms of health and social services are the two health and social services as well as community services, the two largest slices of that pie, but also significant investments in the arts, recreation, the environment, and education. So before I get into the tips and recommendations from a funder perspective, I just want to share this photo and talk about this shift that I'm trying to lead in philanthropy and trying to shift. And this is a picture of, if you're not familiar with it, this is an upside down iceberg that's been flipped on its head. And when I come at the work that I lead in our knowledge philanthropy practice, it's really about disrupting the way that philanthropy works and trying to think about new ways of creating change in communities and adding value that sometimes doesn't always necessarily require money. So I flipped this iceberg to ask the question sometimes, like, I would love to see a time where community projects are inviting funders to apply for them. So instead of us receiving grants, we are the ones competing to fund awesome projects. Just imagine what kind of a shift that could be in the community scape and in the funding landscape if funders were coming together and competing for your awesome projects. It's a shift in mindset, and even if that's not the case today, I think thinking about it from that other alternative perspective can be really helpful in helping to reframe the relationship sometimes between funders and community-based organizations. So I just leave you the flipped iceberg for an ideal future state, but because we're now in a more traditional space right now, we haven't quite flipped that iceberg yet. I will give you from what I think what are six tips on grant writing from a funder's perspective. And this comes with the caveat that this is not the opinion of every funder, but specifically from our perspective here at Community Foundations of Canada and my experience in granting. So the first step is to determine whether you're even eligible to apply for funding or to receive funding from the foundation. This is a very simple kind of, as Stachen talked about, doing the research and making sure that your project aligned and that you're actually qualified as an organization and eligible to receive funding. A lot of foundations have requirements in terms of the types of organizations or partnerships or collaborations that they will fund. You might need to be what's called a qualified donee in some cases, which means you are a registered charity or a registered sports association or an academic institution. So it's really important to find out for each funder, based on the funding stream that they are applying for, what are the eligibility requirements and what type of organizations or collaborations will they fund. In some cases, that means working in partnership with another organization. So if you don't have charitable status, it might mean working with a community-based organization in partnership who would be the fiscal agent for your grant or your project. There's a number of ways of doing it, but first step is to make sure you're eligible and you have the right type of system or process in place to be able to receive the funding from the grant maker. Other questions too, just related to eligibility. Are you able to meet the deadline? It's ambitious. There's a lot of funding opportunities. Are you going to have the time to put a thoughtful application in and meet the eligibility requirements of the funding stream? As Stachen's earlier example mentioning the fact that someone overlooked that this was a capital grants program instead of a programmatic grants program. That's a significant waste of time and effort if you're not aligning with what the funders are actually offering. Second step, once you figured out if you can actually qualify to get the grant, is to determine fit. And this is the question I asked: does your project or your initiative align with the funding priorities? And there's a bit of a challenge sometimes too in terms of who is best positioned to identify priorities. But a lot of times in the current paradigm, you really sort of have to make sure that you're answering or responding to a need that a funder is addressing or is interested in addressing in their communities. This is particularly interesting for community foundations, and this is a bit of a nuance because community foundations also manage investments and granting programs for other donors who might have a particular focus area. So the community foundation itself may have identified priority areas, but individual donors may also have what's called designated or donor-directed giving, So it's important to find out, even if it's not with that community foundation's interest, is there a particular donor, a high net worth individual, or an organization that holds a fund at the community foundation that is interested in that work? So going back to that research that Stachen says, do a little bit of digging to find out with your funders and what are the actual interest areas and impact areas that are interested in funding. The other thing too is just, again, going back to the research and what is the impact you're going to cause with your project? How are you able to demonstrate that your project or initiative will have this impact? So it's important to back it up with some research, some data, and some community knowledge that you have to help articulate how you are going to respond to the focus area and the impact that the funder is looking to achieve. Sorry. Third tip, build a relationship. So again here, a grant is not just a transaction. I have a funny recollection when I first started working for Community Foundations of Canada and go to conferences and workshops or meetings, and everyone was really nice to me. And people are usually nice, and that's fine, but I've just found it, particularly if people were super friendly. And I was talking with another colleague at the end of the conference, and he said to me in a sort of older, curmudgeonly kind of voice saying, the only reason they're being nice to you is because the word foundation is on your lanyard. So interesting that sometimes everyone thinks it's about the dollar chasing and building the relationships inside of this courtship of funders and projects and things like that. And I didn't realize that, but it's true. And there is a certain inauthenticity to those kinds of relationships that is kind of off-putting. And I really like Stachen's comment earlier that we don't fund proposals, we fund people. And it's really important to build and reach out and build those authentic relationships with funders. Another point here is to remember that it's not always about the money. There are other ways that you can activate a relationship with a funder or a grant-making organization. Leveraging their networks and other non-financial capital are also valuable. In my work with the Community Knowledge Exchange, we went to a couple of funders to seek funding, and they weren't able to fund their work, but they were able to make connections to other funders who were interested in our work. So always keep an open mind and have an open ear and eye in those things, and not be afraid of a no, but ask for those opportunities to build those relationships and make those connections. And again, too, I think from my own experience sitting on both sides of the table, I think it's really critical that you build strong relationships with a few funders that are really going to support your work and see you through the long term, rather than poor or less strong relationships with a number of funders. So I think it's really about being strategic and sharpening your focus to focus on the funders and the partners that are working and are aligned with the work that you're doing. My fourth tip is to do your research. I know we talked about this already, and I think you're probably going to hear this 4 or 5 more times before the end of the webinar. But research is not a 4-letter word. It's really important, especially to do a little bit of, when you think of an academic research, if you're working in a space, we do what's called a literature review. So, or you do a landscape review, or any of that, and it's really important to do that as well. Who else is doing this type of work? Funders really like to, you might have a great idea, but somebody else might already be doing something like that. And it might be great to partner with them or to learn from them. For me, what's really exciting about this is this notion that we don't fund individual projects. We're trying to fund a broad spectrum of change. And is there an opportunity for you to take something that has been created by another funded project and adapt it to your instance? I'll give a specific example of that. In my work with the building out the Community Knowledge Exchange, I came across a tool called the Strong Field Framework from a foundation in the US, which basically outlined a process for field building and doing exactly the work that I was planning on doing, which allowed me to realign my funding request to actually activate this existing resource and adapt it for my use instead of starting from scratch. So wherever you can, do your research, find out who else is doing this work. How can you learn, beg, borrow, steal, adapt, evolve from other things? And it's also, when submitting your application, demonstrating that you've done that research and you have a strong understanding of what works in that space will help bolster your credibility and your the strength of your application. So tip number 5 is to make the ask. So here you put your best foot forward, and this is really, I'm talking specifically about the actual application process. And it's really important that they might seem sometimes cumbersome. I don't know if anyone here, I'm sure there are people here who have applied for SHRC funding, And I'm of the mindset that if you make it through the SSHRC application process, like you're the last person standing and you will get the funding because the process is so cumbersome and complex. But, you know, kidding aside, it is really important, I think, that you follow the process because they are there for a reason that will help streamline the applications, and each funder's process might be a little bit different. It's important to respect the timelines, be succinct and get to the point, especially in online applications, and I think sometimes we see those, you know, boxes with word limits and then opportunities to add, you know, comments at the end. This is a really good, important exercise in preparing your application and being really honing in and peeling back all of the fluff from your application and all the things that are kind of superfluous to what you're asking for. So really following the word limits are your friends in this case, and think of them that way because they will help sharpen your focus and make your pitch a stronger pitch. And again, don't forget to check all the boxes. Make sure that if we ask for a copy of financial statements or things like that, that you include that as well. Because a lot of cases, it's like applying for a job. If there's an incomplete application that's processed, it sometimes goes to the bottom of the queue. So making sure that your application is well documented. And another tip here, have somebody else look at it before you submit it, or someone else on your team or another partner organization, just to make sure that they've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. And the last point on this one is don't be afraid to ask the funder for help during the process. A lot of funders have online application systems where they actually see the draft application before you submit it, and actually can be of help to you in submitting the application. So the grant review team or the partnerships that you build a really awesome, authentic relationship with are there as your advocate to bring your funding application to the board. My approach to receiving grant applications is to find a way to say yes. So the ones that make it through the grant review process, the grant officer at the foundation is your advocate. And you need to work with them to bring that to the final decision-making body. And they are working for you and with you, looking for a way to say yes. And the last thing, so this is the last set of tips, assuming everything goes well and you do get the grant and the funding, it's time to get to work. And here I think, you know, beyond actually getting the work done and doing the things you said you're going to do, it's really important to keep an open relationship and communication with the funder over the course of the project if they choose to be engaged or informed. Because for the funders too, it's also an opportunity for them to share their impact and to find out what's going on. Again, too, don't be afraid to fail. It's really important to share what you've learned, and I think a lot of times we're afraid to come back and say, well, things didn't work out the way we thought they would, or this outcome didn't actually get achieved. You can't control for every outcome. You're not innovating or creating change in a vacuum. There are going to be externalities that will affect things, you know, the political climate, a change in policy, a natural disaster. Things will happen that you didn't account for when you did your initial application, and that's okay. What's important is to keep an open line of communication with the funder and other partners in your project to see how you can course correct and see what you can do to change given the new field conditions that you're going to be operating in. I think I'm going to leave it there. So thanks very much those are my 6 tips and pieces of advice from a funder's perspective. And I think I'm going to throw it back to Catalin now for a bit of a conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lee. That was fantastic. Both of those presentations were extremely informative, especially since a lot of the people that are joining us may not have, any experience even filling out a grant. So this is all, preparation for the first time. So I think what we're going to do now is have a little bit of a discussion. So for you participants that are out there listening, please use the chat box to type in questions that you might have, and do indicate for us whether your question, pertains to Stachen or to Lee, to either their presentations or to their positions. Lee working for a foundation and Stachen at the community development and community engagement perspective. So definitely a lot of useful information in both of those presentations. I liked especially, how you're encouraged to kind of see the whole process as a learning opportunity. And don't be afraid to reach out to your funder and to ask questions throughout the process because that really is one of the best ways that you can build your own capacity while also building a relationship with the funder. So that can be really, really key. And of course, something else, Stachen mentioned this during our practice session. It's a good idea to use, a checklist of all the different supplementary documents and letters of support from partners and budget items and all these sorts of things. You don't want to forget any of those supplementary documents. It can make the difference between whether your application goes into the read pile or whether it goes into, the trash can. So do make sure that you include everything the funder is looking for. They're asking for it for a reason. And one of the other things that was running really nicely through both of these presentations is, that idea about telling a story and really, cementing a vision so that the person that's reading your application can really, envision what your project will achieve, the impact it will have, the relationships it will build. So that's key as well. And actually on that, we had a question that was submitted. Rebecca Jacobs, I'm not sure if you're on the line right now, but Stachen, Rebecca was asking how to tell effective stories in your application. And I wondered, Stachen, if you might give us a couple of tips on that.
Sure. So one of the things is, as I talked in the presentation, around utilizing the evaluations that you have gathered from your working community to share your story. So there are sometimes questions, what is the need in the community, for example, and that will be an opportunity to utilize testimonials, your statistics, some of your internal statistics to share that story, or even in a question around what are your evaluation tools and how you plan to utilize things learned in your project to inform next steps. That is an opportunity to say, this is what we've done in the past, give an example, and this is how we're going to utilize this within that project. So you can look at different parts of your application, again, because word counts are so small that you can look at the different parts and see, okay, I may not be able to answer everything in this question, but I could use this information and tweak it a little bit in another question to share my story.
Thank you, Stachen. That's great advice. And so as Nicole has posed another question here, we also had Margaret Tucker. I'm not sure if you're out there, Margaret, but submit a very similar question. So Lee, this one's for you. Maybe you can provide some insight. With the limits to the word count in many of these online applications these days where, you sometimes even have to count the spaces in between the words, what are some tips for getting across a request in very limited space?
That's a great question, and I know that sometimes the word count and the word limit, first of all, again, flip the iceberg here. The word limit and the word count space is your friend, because it's going to make you want to sharpen your focus and get rid of all the fluff that does it. And, you don't answer the question, in this project we are going to, like when you start an essay, in this essay I'm going to talk about this. We can stop with that kind of language and just get right to the point of things. And I think what else is helpful beyond the application is to have that relationship with the person who's going to be reviewing and moving that forward, because they will have an understanding of the project that isn't going to be captured in specifically the application form. I know that's not always the case with large, nebulous funding institutions, which will remain unnamed, sure. But in this case, like with a community-based funder, you can build that relationship so that you have that person's, they get a sense of the project and can advocate for it beyond what you actually put through in the application form.
Lovely. Thank you, Lee. Now, Stachen, we were mentioning checklists, and there's another question here. I know for myself, I'm hyper-organized, and so when I'm going through a grant application, I'm always making a list of all the different things that I have to get. But is there a useful checklist template out there maybe even on the Suffice resources list on the website. Is there a template out there that we could use for a checklist resource?
Well, I haven't actually came across one. I mean, I do have some resources that I can share with Nicole, and she can put that up afterwards. But each grant will be different. And so some may require support letters from partners. Some may require letters of patent for your organization, year of registration, all those different pieces. Each one is different. So when you begin writing an application is to read all the things that are being requested, and you create your own sort of checklist. But I would provide some resources that will sort of help to shape what a typical checklist looks like.
That's great. Thank you, Stachen. So yes, Melina and then others out there that are interested, we'll make sure that Stachen sends that to Nicole, and she'll send it out with these webinar documents. But also, hopefully, we'll be able to post that on the Suffice website so that others can see it as well. So I see that Carly has posed a question here, and it's directed to you, Lee. If we're using the iceberg model to use the word limit to our benefit, how does that include academic jargon? Should applications be completed in plain language? What do you think, Lee?
I think yes, absolutely, because when you, especially if you're talking about a community funder or an organization that's not an institutional funder that works in your language, I'm actually going to qualify that by saying if it's a funder that works in your space that gets the jargon, then I would use it but clarify it. But in a lot of, we have a lot of acronyms in a lot of our social change work, like ABC, asset-based community development, all the things that we're doing, and even that more nuanced jargon. I would try to do it in plain language, because at the end of the day, the people who are going to be reviewing it are people, on grant review teams might not have the same level of expertise. So it might be worthwhile to include, a lot of the applications include an opportunity for you to include, resource documents or additional documentation. You might consider putting together a glossary of terms that gives a little bit more context around some of those things, so that you're not spending time defining what all the jargon is in the application. But use the keywords and the event-specific words, the program-specific language as needed, because sometimes it's also important to use the language that you're, if it's a system thing, or if it's an actual, there's an academic rigor to a process or a certain community intervention, you're going to want to use that language to demonstrate that you're, working in that frame. But as much as possible, I think, keep the jargon to a minimum, and if you can include a glossary or some other context thing as an additional document, I think that would be super helpful.
Thank you, Lee. And I think maybe, Crystal, that might tie into your question about using short forms or acronyms. It's always important to be sure that those things are defined up front. And as Lee suggested, maybe including a glossary of terms so that someone can flip to that if they, lose track because you have so many acronyms, which can easily happen in the industry I work in First Nations education. Now, Stachen, I wonder maybe if you might shed some light. We had a question here that was proposed by Margaret Toy. And Margaret, if you're there, I hope I'm saying your last name right. She was wondering specifically about funding out there, and Lee, feel free to jump in at the end as well, funding that links academic research with community organizations.
Okay, well, I can definitely add, and I mean, each different project that you could apply for, there may be different funders. So, for example, with Braids for AIDS, there was a project that we worked with a collaborative of Black women who needed a not-for-profit to gain funding through the Women's College Hospital, and that was a research project. So again, you have to you have to do the research to find out which organization. So, you know, there's hospitals, there's governments, individuals that may have an interest in your project, at that area of work, and you want to do your research to be able to find. But from my sort of knowledge, some of the hospitals, environmental centers, they will fund, but you have to do your research around it.
Thank you, Stachen. Lee, did you have any thoughts on that you wanted to add?
No, I'm actually looking for a link to a blog post to answer Jacqueline's question. So I'm just going to grab a link from a post that I wrote about how sometimes the funding process is actually the problem. So I'm just going to try to find that and throw it in the chat box for everyone.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lee. And perhaps Nicole will send that out as well with the webinar resources. Okay, well, Eva has a question that, you know, I'd love to hear the answer to as well. So when you're doing a literature review to ground the project in research, of course, what is the best way to cite sources without jeopardizing the word count or making it seem, you know, too academic-y? Stachen, maybe, do you have some thoughts on that?
I think, again, a lot of applications may have opportunities to have supporting documents. So, you know, a simple way is after writing an application, like a line, and you want to cite something, you might put the number 1. And when you have your supporting documents and you have your references, you can say, well, 1 referred to this piece. So that will be a way of, you know, not jeopardizing some of the word count by having that supporting document and then citing in that piece, but utilizing a creative way of showing, okay, this corresponds to this part of the application. And I actually did that when I was applying for a Trillium Foundation grant to support a prison project in here in Toronto around HIV, and so there was a lot of like literary research, and what we did is just sort of put some of that information in our supporting documentation.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stachen. And in response to Jacqueline's question, you see there that Lee has posted a blog post, and please, everyone, check it out. I think we're nearing the end of our session here, so thank you to everybody so much for participating. And before you go, we would love to have a little bit of feedback from you. So you're going to see a poll come up on your screen, and thank you, Adobe Connect, for being so user-friendly. So if everyone could just, you know, quickly take a look at each one of those questions and fill it out by clicking in the box for your answer. The question at the very bottom, the last one, what webinar topics would you like to see in the future? That's just a one-liner, so if you have more than one answer, please separate it by a comma or a semicolon. Alrighty, well, thank you so much, everyone, again, for your participation and for your feedback. And take a look there before you go. It looks like Stachen has also, let's see here, provided a link to check out. And anything that's been mentioned today, you know, the checklist, the blog post, the PowerPoint presentations, of course, and the recording are all going to be sent out to the webinar participants within the next 24 hours. So thank you so much to Nicole Bedford for getting us organized and doing that. And in terms of the next webinar that we'll be offering, please be sure to sign up for the Suffice Connections newsletter or to visit our website often, and that's where you can find out what we are going to offer in the future. So thanks everyone so much, and have a great day.